Welcome to the latest instalment of Close Readings. My name is Seamus Perry and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic and Professor of English Literature at University College London. In this series, we are taking each time an individual poem, one chosen because it is, in one way or another, political, or about politics, or has been read politically. And our poem today is Yeats's great poem about the Dublin uprising, Easter 1916. So, Mark, I suppose the first thing we could usefully do is say a little bit about the historical event that this poem memorialises.
Yes, I mean, this is the foundation of Irish nationalism in some ways. That it propelled the movement towards freeing Ireland from British rule, which had been going on for many, many centuries. And it as a sort of revolutionary event, it didn't really bear comparison with the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, in that it was almost aborted, really, by most of the main actors. And the bits of the revolution, the rising that did happen, they took over a biscuit factory,
More a biscuit tin,
as well as the post office, most kind of famously. They didn't take Dublin Castle, though in fact it was undefended. So in terms of the military strategy behind it, it was a kind of ragtag, failed operation, and yet it becomes mythically the most important event in Irish history in the 20th century, and it's commemorated in 50 years on, 100 years on, and so on. So it is, and it obviously ties into ideas of the political martyr, that the 15 men who were taken out and shot afterwards, and that was the in some ways the key political event of it. It was the martyrdom of the 15 men, and then the following year Casement, Roger Casement, been running guns from Germany in the hope of fomenting a revolution, is hanged in Britain. And so it becomes in Irish mythology absolutely crucial to the Irish Republican movement.
So these are deaths that seem, on the face of it, to be pointless and ineffective, but actually, with the passing of time, turn out to be redemptive and salvational. So I guess this is why Easter is flagged by Yeats in his title.
Absolutely. It was April the 24th, 1916, that it happened. And Yeats was profoundly troubled by it. I mean, he knew Padraig Pearse and he knew Thomas Macdonogh. Obviously knew John McBride. All those three are mentioned in the poem. McBride had married Maud Gonne, but he was a drunken, vainglorious lout, according to Yeats. And there is evidence that McBride was abusive, possibly towards Iseult, her daughter, as well as to Maud. But Maud Gonne, who was a linchpin of nationalism, Irish nationalism, and disagreed with Yeats, who was much more wishy-washy. I think it's would be one way of putting it in relation to whether or not violence should be used. There's an extent to which Maud Gonne does underlie the poem, and hers is the heart that's turned to stone in some ways. So it's both an elegy for the martyrs, as well as in some ways a refraction of his own disagreements with Maud Gonne. And in the process of writing it in 1916, he proposed, as I believe, to Maud Gonne again, and also to Iseult. Yes. So his obsession with the Gonnes was still up and running at this point, though he marries not that long afterwards. And it is, in some ways, a meditation on his own relationship to Ireland, his own relationship to republicanism or to nationalism. And it's deeply ambivalent in all sorts of interesting ways.
So the figure of Maud Gonne is an important one to keep in the back of our minds, isn't it? She's not referenced directly in the poem, is she? But she does become, for Yeats, an example of what a life might become if you allow yourself to be defined by your political beliefs, especially by your radical or your militant political beliefs. And I suppose one of the things that the poem calls into question is whether political commitment of that kind is worth it. So when Maud Gonne reads the poem, she writes a very cross letter to Yeats, doesn't she, saying she doesn't like the poem. It's not worthy of the heroism of the men who have died in it. She's so struck by the symbolism of the deaths that even though she's been separated from her horrible husband for 10 or 12 years or whatever it is, she assumes the name Maud Gonne McBride again, because he's kind of redeemed himself in a way in this extraordinary uprising. So that sense of the ambivalence of political commitment or political dedication, that's an important element in the poems.
Yes, and it comes very early in his sort of responses to the event. There's a letter in May 11th in which he talks about how a terrible beauty has been born. So that phrase, which is kind of the crucial and one of the most famous sort of lines in poetry, a terrible beauty is born, captures his sense of the sublime nature or mythical nature of the events. And if you look at it in relation to Yeats's own kind of worldview, it's not that different from the way he presents, say, in Leader and the Swan, for instance, the descent of some kind of mythical power into the everyday, which transforms things altogether. So that was, or the Second Coming. So that was very kind of crucial to his understanding of history, was this, you could call it slightly, is the word crazy too much? That he does have this vision of some kind of supernatural event, not related necessarily to Christianity, but some all-transforming event suddenly appearing amidst the everyday. So the first stanza, I've met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses, puts us right in quotidian Dublin. Yep. And this is the pretty bourgeoisie, isn't it? They're working in desks. They're almost like Dickensian clerks or something.
Absolutely.
And he knows them because everyone knows everyone in Dublin, and passes with a nod. And then in his aristocratic way, and he's being quite self-critical here, he presents himself as making a joke at their expense when he goes to his club, to which they would not be kind of entitled to membership. So part of Yeats's vision of Ireland was of a kind of aristocratic ideal and lots of nice hard-working peasants, but he didn't like the middle classes, particularly the Catholic bourgeois middle classes. So one of the shocks the poem is registering is how these people who belong to the Catholic middle classes have suddenly been transformed into heroic visionary martyrs.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, that the terms in which Yeats thinks about their political martyrdom are aesthetic. So, in other words, what's being born isn't really a political idea, is it? It's terrible. So, the sorts of emotion that, let's say, famously Aristotle associates with tragedy, but also beauty. How do you think beauty fits into this sort of political landscape? It's a very, I mean, you're right, we're so used to this phrase. It's a very striking phrase, but it's odd that, in a way, Yeats should be so moved by the transformation of these lives into an aesthetic spectacle somehow.
I think the beauty derives from the act of transfiguration, so that, as with Leader and the Swan or the Second Coming, or in this poem, the transfiguration of the ordinary into the extraordinary, and the extraordinary being aesthetic, beautiful, powerful, sublime. In a way, it's a high romantic vision of the ways in which the divine can interpenetrate with the ordinary, but it's stripped of its kind of religious connotations, and here connected to Irish nationalism. And Pearse and MacDonagh were both kind of cloudy, mystic nationalists, while James Connolly was a socialist and committed to kind of left-wing views. So there was a very, very different set of actors in the Easter Rising, and Connolly is not mentioned in the second stanza when he goes through four characters who would have been recognised by Dubliners immediately. And interesting on the Maud Gonne element is Con Markievicz, or Constance Gore Booth, as she was born, who was pardoned because she was a woman. I mean, she was at St Stephen's Green, and whether she fired or not, I think is not clear. But there's a picture of her with a revolver, which kind of cements her image of herself as a kind of a revolutionary on the barricades. And Yeats had known her as a child. I mean, they were in Sligo. They had Sligo childhoods together. And here is this woman who has been, who he is fairly critical of, that as with Maud Gonne, he feels, and this may make Yeats seem not that progressive in relation to sexual or gender relations, that her voice has grown shrill because she's been kind of, haranguing people politically.
Politicised, absolutely. It's interesting that that's the first That's the first of the rebels that he mentions, isn't it? In the second verse, which gives us the little catalogue of what Yeats takes to be the principal players. And Con Markovitz here is clearly a kind of surrogate, isn't she, for Maud Gonne in a way. She is someone whose beauty has been destroyed by political engagement. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers? When young and beautiful she rode to harriers. So her sweetness and her beauty has been destroyed by her political engagement.
And she's also betrayed her aristocratic kind of upbringing and ideals, that we see her riding, going to harriers, it's riding with the hounds, it's chasing, it's hunting. So here's this woman who could have been an icon of Irish aristocratic womanhood who has gone to the barricades. And that is seen as a betrayal. And I agree that to some extent she is not exactly a surrogate for Maud Gonne, but that they are linked in his mind as two people his vision of the ideal woman, and it is an idealization they have betrayed in some ways. But maybe that's how he likes it. It gets his poetry going. That's actually what works for him, to the extent to which he himself can present himself not exactly as a martyr, but as somebody who is suffering these betrayals.
Yeah.
And the poetry comes out of some sense of betrayal.
Yeah.
And I think betrayal, as well as kind of visionary nationalism, is going on in this poem. And its ambivalence, obviously, like Marvell's Horatian Ode, is what makes it such a great poem, because it isn't propaganda in any obvious way. In fact, he didn't circulate it after it was published because it would have been seen as kind of dangerous in some ways to the nationalist cause, because he still seems to believe that home rule is going to happen, that England may keep faith. But the idea of home rule was anathema to the Irish Republican Brotherhood and all good kind of, Sinn Féiners. They didn't want home rule, they wanted independence. So Yeats, to that extent, like Marvell, is a bit of a trimmer in the way he presents his reactions to it, to the events. But he does say that they have changed things utterly.
If you enjoyed this episode, please do try signing up to the Close Reading subscription. You can sign up directly in Apple Podcasts or in other podcast apps. Just follow the links in the description.